Thanks again for joining our webinar today, How to Prepare for Major Sports Events. Today we're going to talk what it really takes to prepare stream for major sports. We're going to use our real experience from FIFA Club World Cup 25, delivered by DAZN, M2A Media, and Unified Streaming. We have two speakers today, Andy Wilson, SVP of Customer Success at M2A Media. And he has more than 20 years of experience in broadcast and media with technical solutions, product roles across companies, including Friend MTs, Oyala, Red Bee, and BBC. He brings deep experience in complex media processing and delivery platforms. And we also have Giacomo Benelli, pre-sales engineer at Unified Streaming. He works across solution architecture, system integration, POCs, customer success, practical video delivery challenges for broadcasters, OTT, online media teams. And my name is Ksenia. I'm going to be your host today. I work for Unified Streaming, and I think that's the main thing you should know about me today, because I'm not the star here. And just to start, I would say we can all agree that sports is a major stress test. And since we want to stick this webinar as practical as possible, I will ask Andy to set up the scene for us and share a little bit more about the project of delivering FIFA Club World Cup 25. Andy.
Sure. Thank you, Ksenia. It's a great introduction. I guess a little bit about me. I'm Andy Wilson. I run customer success at M2A Media. For those that don't know, M2A Media is a relatively small company that punches well above its weight in terms of its customer base and the events that we run. So we're primarily a kind of a B2B and B2C services company, leveraging cloud services, particularly the AWS cloud, to deliver massive events for very large customers. And that's events that could go global. And one of the such events is obviously the FIFA Club World Cup in June, July last year. And obviously we're also heavily involved in delivering the FIFA World Cup for DAZN and others this year. So it's very pertinent that we get to discuss this topic again. So as a bit of the scene, we've been working with large sports right holders and broadcasters like DAZN for many years. And if we wind back to, I believe it was kind of December timeline of 2024, when we started talking to DAZN about some new projects in the new year, getting really excited about what was going to happen early in the new year, lining up some new features and products, etc. for them. And then, we all went off for Christmas, came back in January, and we had a very hurried meeting arranged to say, by the way, we've just sold, we just bought global exclusive rights to the FIFA Club World Cup. And we'd like you to help us deliver it. We've been working with DAZN for, probably since the inception of M2A Media, as the primary head-end provider. And, it was natural for them to come to us to facilitate this massive shift for their broadcast capability and their live streaming capability. The core essence of this was bringing in feeds from all over the United States, obviously in very low latency, a variety of different formats, them getting aggregated within DAZN's broadcast systems, them creating multiple variants of those broadcasts, targeting 27 different territories and language variants, and obviously all of those needing to go out to a global customer base. And the crux of our solution was to spin up a significant number of dedicated broadcast channels to facilitate kind of the ingest, and then obviously re-encoding, repackaging, and then obviously redelivery of those live streaming channels out to their global user base. So as a high level, it's all based on in Amazon. So live cloud native live distribution workflows. We're having to orchestrate hundreds of channels concurrently across multiple AWS regions for extremely high resilience, high reliability in case of any kind of disasters within the AWS cloud. Obviously, all this is done very dynamically. So we were spinning up resources only when they're needed and shutting resources down as soon as we could. As soon as events had finished. Obviously, when you're running hundreds of channels at global scale, that can get quite expensive. So being able to dynamically provision those workloads and then shut them down as quickly as possible was essential for maintaining cost control. We had to deliver a number of other different variations around codec support and profile support. So obviously, including HDR output in a couple of different formats, and delivering Dolby surround sound out to the premium subscriber base within DAZN. And just as a quick example, having to manage 100,000 plus, it's about 130,000 different instances over a 4 to 6 week period. And orchestrating that, precisely when they're required, and obviously dealing with exceptions, and obviously making sure that everything shuts down when it's not required at the end of it. And obviously being able to do this while maintaining very, very high availability of those live streams out to consumers. Live sport is one of the most insanely critical pieces of broadcast. You can't make a mistake. Everything in live broadcast has to be delivered, as accurately as possible, reliably as possible, without breaks, without picture degradation, and maintaining 100% user experience. There is no second chance in live sport. So being able to do that without service interruption was absolutely critical. And as a result of the efforts from various of my teams and teams in DAZN, we had near flawless delivery of 63 matches. DAZN were able to bring in a significant number of new subscribers as a result of the work that they did, and obviously bringing in those rights. And as a result, DAZN are a much stronger business. And I'm really, really glad that we were able to play a part in that delivery of the service.
Thank you, and it's great. It feels great to know that our products are part of this bigger solution. So it's like we're really proud of our joint work together. But it's obvious that such events require a lot of preparation work. And the question is, where does the biggest operational complexity sit? Is it ingest, encoding, packaging, ad insertion?
I'd have to say everywhere. There isn't one area of the service that doesn't require very, very fine detailed attention. When you're doing day-to-day live streaming, we stream out about 1,200 events a week for people like DAZN, and including our other customers, it's in the region of 3,000 or 4,000 events a week. We've built systems so that they are very, very reliable. They're very, very fault tolerant. They can deal with exceptions very well. And we have self-healing and recovery processes in place to maintain those really high service levels that our customers expect. When it comes to doing a tournament such as Club World Cup or the World Cup, where there's an order of magnitude higher audience, the potential for, or many orders of magnitude higher audience, then the stakes do get higher. And particularly if you're bringing in a lot of different variants, but actually different camera angles, etc. You're having to duplicate a number of components to be able to ingest that additional content. If you're having dedicated lines set up and dedicated studios set up for multi-language variants and obviously presenters who are in territory, then obviously that increases complexity of the ingest path quite considerably. And making sure that you've got sufficient quotas, etc., to be able to manage that from an infrastructure perspective is really critical. In terms of actually the encoding and packaging, to be honest, that's actually one of the more simple bits. If you're able to run this for one channel, then in theory you should be able to run this for thousands of channels. But the devil's always in the detail. And actually, what we found very quickly during testing was that when we're making requests to bring up 300 or 400 encoders concurrently, and then duplicate that across 4 or 5 different regions, then we find that the major infrastructure as a service vendors tend to have some problems. So working with the cloud vendors to ensure they've got sufficient capacity many months in advance of the big tournaments is absolutely critical. Spinning up for a weekend where you may have like 100 or 200 matches starting is one thing. Doing that when you're bringing up those typical events and another 100 channels, and doing it over 4 regions and with multiple variants of each of those, it gets complex fairly quickly. And obviously another one is the orchestration systems that you have in place to manage those cloud resources. If you're going to be spinning up thousands of instances or hundreds of channels, then obviously making them as robust as possible to failures, making them fault tolerant. And the key thing everywhere is testing, testing, testing. Load test absolutely every portion of your infrastructure. They did that one small bit where you make an assumption, you think that's going to work fine. You almost guarantee that's going to kick you in the butt. When you get to the live events. We spent the best part of 3 months testing infrastructure as hard as we could and throwing everything we could at it. And by and large, that testing, bore out, a bunch of useful work that we did to make our products a bit more robust. But also it highlighted some other areas with infrastructure as a service, particularly cloud services, where we might need to look at throttling of requests, or perhaps staging some of our requests a bit further back from our TX times, just to mitigate some of the kind of thundering herd requests that we were making against those services. From the encoding and packaging perspective, it was actually relatively simple from a purely configuration point of view. But when we suddenly realized that we were going to be spinning up 10,000+ instances for an event, again, order of magnitude higher than we would normally do, we had a sudden realization that from a capacity point of view, we'd have to work with people like Amazon to ensure they had sufficient instances for us to run the origin clusters we needed. The origin clusters are an absolutely critical part of this, and obviously we used unified live origin as this critical component. Being able to make sure that there is sufficient capacity in region for those instance types, perhaps diversifying the instance types that are going to be used, and having automatic reselection of instance types when we see capacity alarms from AWS, and also just making sure that every component within the orchestration, that part of the orchestration chain, is able to deal with throttling if needed. We went as far as from our point of view, where we handed off to DAZN was at our CDN handoff. And obviously, we work with DAZN quite a lot to ensure that they are able to throw as much traffic at us as possible, without causing any kind of degradation in performance. Certainly from an origin perspective, making sure that all requests were served within a couple of 100 milliseconds, and that we had alarms in place so that if we did start to see low profiles creep up, then we could quickly additionally provision capacity to be able to manage that. In a lot of cases, we over provisioned, because again, it's the old adage that you don't get a second chance in live sport. So over provision capacity where you can, and where there's a desire to have something that's bulletproof. And then if the audience sizes aren't quite as large as you imagine, then pare that back slightly. I would caution folks doing that a little bit though, because one of the interesting trends we saw during Club World Cup, and I'm sure we'll see it a lot during the World Cup as well, is that if a goal happened or if a foul happened, all of the other amazing work that DAZN's editorial teams were doing to syndicate out clips from the live games out to social media, that resulted in huge swathes of traffic coming to the platform. Particularly if you're getting near time, or there was a nail biting finish that was looking likely, then you'd suddenly see a thundering herd of traffic suddenly hitting the platform as users suddenly realized this is a great match, we need to go and watch this. And obviously, we saw corresponding increases in traffic on our side of the chain as well.
Thank you. I saw Giacomo nodding actively.
Yeah. I mean, the first time we talked about this with Andy, I was amazed at how much complexity was coming from all directions, and there's really a lot to handle there. One thing that struck me was the sheer amount of variations of a single channel that you have to generate. Now, you mentioned something like more than 20 for each channel. Was it 25, something like that?
Yeah, it was 27.
You handed that
27 variants
for those.
Essentially, it was a case of before we get hit TX time for the first round of events, for 100+ channels, we were bringing them up and doing testing. We did then actually decided to go and go full bore testing and actually bring up 27 channels, times however many concurrent events. I think it was a peak of 6 concurrent events, and have a primary and backup for those, and across all 4 regions. So we did test at full production scale. we had to be sure that we wouldn't hit any other pinch points. And obviously, we work very closely with yourselves at Unified on that. We work very closely with our partners at Amazon. We work very closely with our partners at Eto to make sure that everything from a DRM licensing perspective was there, and that they were guaranteed that this would work as needed. And in the end, it was decided that actually, given that most of the Club World Cup was going to be free to wear, for the primary user base, which is free to wear, actually ended up turning off lots of the security controls like DRM and watermarking, because actually piracy wasn't going to be perceived as being a big problem. That's obviously very different for other events where that's something you have to be really cognizant of, and correspondingly, you need to make sure you do things like scaling up your DRM licensing systems and user authentication systems and all of those other lovely bits and pieces to deal, again, with the massive load profiles you'll see on these big tentpole events.
That's great. Do you think this is going to get any worse in the next World Cup?
No, I mean, I don't think we're doing quite as many variations this time. As there's a kind of exclusivity with DAZN, but we're covering World Cup for a number of customers now, and the kind of the attention to detail and the focus from our point of view isn't any different. Our teams are working diligently to make sure that everything's ready for next week. Obviously, the first match is on Thursday of next week, and everything looks good from our point of view, and I'm sure for the next big tentpole events as well.
That's great.
Since you already covered traffic spikes, totally agree. If your architecture works only with predictable traffic, then something goes wrong for sports. But if we are talking about thundering herd, if we are talking about a lot of people joining the stream all together, then what's the best way to manage synchronized spikes for the event?
I think is, where possible, try and soften out those spikes. Anything that you can do in terms of getting your audience on the platform in a staggered form is going to help you. That could be something as simple as, trying to mitigate, a massive thundering herd of folks coming in to, obtain a streaming URL. So your playback systems, again, whatever you can do to try and add some jitter to those requests so you don't have, 10 million, 100 million people coming in simultaneously to get those requests. Where you can diversify your endpoints, regionally to make sure that you're able to route traffic appropriately, and have, from an auth perspective or a stream acquisition perspective, getting playback URLs or getting DRM licenses, etc. Making sure that you route that traffic to different regional pops, so you can actually not rely on a single point of presence where you're going to get a lot of traffic. But if you can diversify that as much as possible and spread that traffic out, then you're going to fare a lot better, particularly with a mass scale event. Some interesting things we saw around some other live events where we get very large traffic spikes. Even something as simple as having when you start your playback experience, running a pre-roll. Having a pre-roll in there of a set length to set the scene as to what the user's about to experience, that can add just a little bit of delay to some of your requests that are hitting your licensing systems and your other playback systems, so that again you're mitigating the amount of load that's going to hit those licensing systems and those playback systems at any one time. It's an ongoing battle.
Giacomo, do you want to add anything?
Well, yes, it's that's the main problem indeed, and there's many techniques that I'm sure Andy has applied successfully. But from our side, I think it's important that basically we design our tools in a way that we always keep in mind scalability, because basically you have to be able to scale the resources dynamically, as Andy was saying, for peaks, but also because, of course, of cost reason, because you need to handle a certain amount of traffic at certain point in times, and then you can just deprovision that when you don't need them anymore. So from this point of view, I think it's important that the system that M2A is using is designed around the origin, which is basically a stateless origin, which makes it quite easy to write, easier than it could be to write a system that scales, because basically it gives you a software that You can scale very easily because each copy, each instance of that software is equivalent to the other one. So you can substitute one with another, and you can add more if you need more power. So that I think it's something that is leveraged very well to reach this resistance to pick up traffic at any moment in time.
See, this is all made more complex by additional features. So, for example, if you're going to include very large DVR windows, if you've got an event that's running, for 4 or 5 hours, and some of the pre-match commentary and the post-match analysis, the matches were running for 4+ hours. You get to that wonderful threshold of about 3.5, 4 hours where users always want to go back in time and start watching from the beginning. So being able to have instant replay and go back as in your DVR window means you've got to maintain those DVR windows, and doing that across a large cluster of origin nodes becomes fairly complex. And from a computation point of view of calculating positions in manifests, particularly where you're dealing with ad insertion as well, compute gets very heavy very, very quickly. So that's obviously something that is worth bearing in mind. If your user base doesn't need the complexity of features, then you can make this a lot simpler. But where you need to have all the various different bells and whistles, and you need to have things like large DVR windows, then obviously you need to be mindful of the compute that's required to go and do the things like the manifest calculations. And it is quite a heavy task.
And since you already mentioned something about big money and protection and ads, I think it's worth starting talking about the protection of global events like this, because when the global rights are here, it's usually a part of the game. You should provide a certain level of protection to the stream, and it also can cause the spikes and also can cause a lot of troubles on the way. So what's the best approach to protecting the premium stream right now?
There are a variety of ways of approaching this. Obviously, the primary these days is using digital rights management, DRM. So encrypting your content, having robust playback and session authorization systems, so that you're able to authenticate and authorize your user base to get access to certain streams. Give them entitlements to view streams in certain territories on certain devices. Restrict the number of concurrent streams that they can view. If they're in a household, if they've got a household account, obviously, that's kind of the primary mechanism. There's obviously things like watermarking as well. So if you can forensically watermark your content, and if you can do that on a personalized basis, and that's the critical thing, doing on a personalized basis, is obviously being able to, if you do have piracy, and it's something that's inevitable with any kind of any premium rights services, is having to deal with piracy. Being able to actually detect that, and having agents going out and infiltrating piracy groups, and actually going and doing surveys and going and detecting where pirate resources are being used, then obviously being able to recover your watermarks and then identify the potential perpetrators who are leaking that content is a really, really important part of your overall defense.
Yeah, indeed, it's there's no one single solution to protect your content, and and you will say it's a mix of solutions that you have to apply to your stream to make sure that you have the maximum protection that you can do. DRM, of course, is the basis. We know that it's not perfect, of course, but it's what we have, and it hides a lot of complexity in itself, because indeed there are different DRM systems. There is no one DRM system that fits all the devices, so you have to make sure that when you pair your channels, they are DRM encrypted with all the different system IDs that you have to support across all different devices. So that's flexibility that you need to have when you package your content. And it's also important to be able to do that with the help of your favorite DRM provider, and that you'll be able to switch from one to another in case you need to. So it's important also to have that kind of flexibility. And when it comes to protection, indeed, we know that DRM may not be perfect, but it can be made somehow a little bit more resilient to attacks, by, for example, implementing things like key rotation. It's a very complex solution indeed, but it's we've been working on that solution lately, and I think we can propose ways to make that feasible on that level of scale. And so that's basically, instead of just using a key to encrypt your content that doesn't change in time, you can change it more often to increase the level of protection of your content. That's it's a chase between golf and beat. You always have to take the next step, but on the other hand, they're always chasing to find the workaround.
I think high frequency key rotation is one of the next big stepping stones in terms of content protection. There are a large number of services out there who will use the same DRM key for all their assets and all their live streams and all their events. That's generally not a good practice. Using different DRM keys on a per event basis, that's better. Doing that on a per rendition or ladder, or individual ladder basis, that's even better. Having different keys that's used for your HD content versus your UHD content, that's a good thing to do. That's best practice. But when you come into using key rotation, and particularly high frequency key rotation, that's really good defense in depth doing that, to make sure that where you're having to re-authenticate those users in order to issue another key. It's a really, really effective way to be able to turn off users where you see content being reshared, or you see those streams being reshared. Obviously, things like high frequency key rotation do come at a bit of a cost, particularly from a license issuance perspective. If your users are having to go back to entitlement systems, then obviously you've got to mitigate those traffic profiles you see, then the increase there. But there are ways and means around that. But overall, between high frequency key rotation and using forensic watermarking, probably the two best things you can do to mitigate piracy out there and to protect your content, and certainly to be able to analyze and recover from pirate attacks.
I think it's impossible to avoid having pirates, but our goal is to make their life as hard as possible and to provide them with as many challenges as possible. So it definitely helps. And another thing which is impossible to miss when we are talking about sports stream is ads, ad insertion, ad replacement, and everything connected with monetization. And here, I assume it also makes your life much more hard.
Oh yes. I mean, if you're an SSAI vendor, then this is familiar territory for you guys, where you're getting those massive numbers of requests, vast requests going into the SSAI services, then having to go and make requests out to all of the other ad services, potentially out to SSPs as well to go and pull in programmatic ads. There's a lot of stuff that needs to go right there to actually make that successful. And having to do that, in a couple of hundred milliseconds, ideally, is quite a challenge. So yeah, big props to those who actually managed to do that successfully. And I think one of the key things you can do is, again, try and smooth out the requests that you're going to force upon your ad services, where you can, do pre-bids as part of programmatic requests. Pre-request your ad inventories, etc., making sure that those requests aren't suddenly going to get all fire at the same time, so that whether you're going to Yospace or GAM or Media Tailor or whoever, you're not always your entire audience of potentially 100 billion people aren't going to make that same ad request or a variant of that ad request at the same time. You're almost guaranteed to cause an outage. So yes, do what you can to spread out those requests. As soon as a user joins the stream, why not go and request your first ad pod? Make sure that's ready so that what ads are going to be inserted. Obviously, if you're doing manifest manipulation, then clearly all of that traffic is going to go via the SSAI directly. Mitigate that perhaps by using SGAI, so using server guided ad insertion as well. So you have a mix of inserted ads and potentially use other ad forms of ads, whether it be interstitials or overlays, etc. Something to complement the experience and to generate revenue, but where you won't always have the big thundering herd going back to the insertion systems.
I'm wondering, Andy, given the complexity of personalizations in these particular scenarios of live streaming, do you have a specific target in terms of personalization? I mean, is any compromise accepted in terms of, hey, it's not going to be per user personalized, it's going to be a little bit less, like I can cluster things, or I can give, personalized ads to different regions, for example, that would simplify things, or per user ads really requirement?
I think 100%, per user tailoring of ads, it isn't something that many providers do well. Obviously, you have to cluster those and profile those users, and you put them into buckets of either based upon their interests or your interests in them. So, if you've seen engagement on some specific ads, then perhaps you put them in a specific bucket of requests that will either get familiar ads or potentially those that are slightly tangential to keep them interested. Personalization is absolutely critical across, maintaining eyes on the platform. If you don't personalize, you'll lose an audience out to the other multitude of providers who are potentially providing the same content. So, maintaining a personal experience, whether that be, through other engagement processes, or whether we're bringing in very tailored ads, or particularly, tailored offers for a user or a small base of users, is really, really critical to that user experience. But, anything you can do to potentially, aggregate certain groups of users is going to be really beneficial from an infrastructure perspective when you suddenly get those requests being made out.
Of course. And you've mentioned both SSAI and guided ad insertion. Okay, so it's of course I'm trying to follow. It looks like we make a full circle on that strategy on ads, because we had client side ad insertion at the moment and server side ad insertion. We're going back to client guided ad insertion. Why do you think is that? What's the driver to get back to client guided ad insertion? Is it personalization? Because it makes it more feasible?
I think there are a couple of things. Obviously, the cost of running SSAI at massive scale, when you're talking, tens or hundreds of millions of users, is quite astonishing. And the infrastructure required to actually do that level of personalization is again, it's mind blowing. And in terms of its complexity, anything you can do to try and reduce that is going to be a good thing. I guess across the industry where everyone's very cost conscious and environmentally conscious. So any other mechanisms we can bring in place to potentially not have to have every bit of your content going through an SSAI, and where you don't have to reinsert ads, is going to be a good thing potentially. But you do lose capability of personalized then. That's problematic from an ad inventory point of view. You want to maintain, quality eyes on screen at any one time, and if you don't personalize, then those eyes will go elsewhere. So, bringing in things like SGI, where you've got client side elements, helps you to enhance that experience from an ad point of view, but also from the user point of view, where you may also not have the opportunity to go to an ad break. If you're watching a tennis match, for example, where yes, you've got some fairly fixed points in your match, where you might want to go to a very quick ad spot for 30 seconds, during a set, in between a set or something like that. Actually, the ability to add an ad when a player, a ball goes out, or a player goes to go and get a drink, or they go and pick up their towel to have a wipe down because it's hot during the match. There's an opportunity there to have a creative come on screen, and to serve an ad. Then, from a monetization perspective, that's going to be really compelling for those advertisers. So it gives you some real flexibility for what you can add to the experience.
Okay. Yeah, that's very interesting use case.
You've also mentioned that you're using Manifest Edit for some of your ad scenarios. Could you share as well?
Well, we do quite a lot within the unified services. I don't think we use anything vanilla, shall we say. It's not out of the box. So there's a bunch of things we do to support some very legacy and esoteric devices within the customer's estate. And that requires us to do some other essentially manifest manipulation. So we've got a layer that sits on top of the unified stack. that allows us to do some other manifest manipulations. That could be us inserting or filtering SCUDdy35 markers and filtering some of the payloads that can be used to drive other client experiences. It could be doing some reordering of tracks. It could be, audio reordering or audio regrouping. One of the cool features that was brought in place before Club World Cup last year was a multi-view experience where a user has the ability to have 4 quadrants or 8 quadrants or eight screens in one feed. And then obviously be able to switch audio dynamically and having to deal with the naming of those different audios from game 1, game 2, game 3, game 4 out of the box with some of the encoder we use, and obviously with the packager. We couldn't manage to personalize some of the descriptions. So again, we use Manifest Edit to do that and to provide that manipulation layer on the Manifest live. Really cool feature. We use it a lot.
Yeah, I think those were the use cases that we had in mind when we introduced Manifest Edit. I mean, it was important for us to have a layer that is a sort of a programmable layer of customization for your manifest, because of course not all the changes and tweaks that you need to apply can be done directly from the origin. It would just multiply the number of options to switch and levers that you have to move from the origin. So it makes much more sense to have that level. It also allows us to be very quick in implementing some changes, some new use cases, because it doesn't basically impact on our basic software life cycle. Because it's not something that is implemented in our core product. It doesn't require C++ development. It doesn't require beta. You can just provide a plugin, a new version of the plugin that can be dropped along the origin, and that implements a new use case, which is cool, and it's a nice way to help our customers when they have such a need.
Yeah, we've got some, there's a couple of other features we use it for. So, I mentioned obviously things like, the manifest rewrites for audio grouping, etc., and SCUDdy35 manipulation and kind of reparsing. There's another couple of features we use it for where, we've got bitrate capping, which is a kind of a not very often used feature. It's a break glass measure where if suddenly you have, a thundering herd of requests coming into your origin where the origin can't cope, and we see the graphs going up and we see the potential for error counts going up, then there's some break glass measure where we can actually cap the bit rates in the ladder. So we actually prevent them being served, and we'll serve a different variant to a request that comes in. And that's all about, protecting the integrity of the origin service, which is something that's vital to do. And yeah, some similar features like that around, the requests that come in on some specific device identifiers through device user agents, etc., where we can actually serve them a tailored manifest that's appropriate to the conditions that they're in, or appropriate to the conditions of the territory that they're in as well. So it means that they're getting a targeted rendition set rather than something that includes all variants.
Thank you.
Yeah, talking about complexity, and it always comes from every direction, indeed.
Thanks a lot. So we've covered main things, which include spikes, DRMs, ads, but we have another big event coming, which you mentioned just around the corner. So looking ahead, we have Men's World Cup coming, and I have a final question to you. If I'm a sports right owner or a streaming platform and I'm preparing for 26 event, what should I do right now? What should I fix? If you name the main priority from your point of view.
Drop everything and come to M2A. We'll work it out. Yeah. I guess the key thing in reality, it's test. We learned so much last year as a result of the massive scale testing that we did. We identified pinch points across the infrastructure, ours and also our partners' infrastructure. And that was vital to our success delivering that event. And it's obviously, we've been repeating similar in the lineup, the run up to next week, to make sure that, that everything that goes, the next set of matches, 104 matches, they go out to users flawlessly. So, primary thing is just test. Uncover every stone don't make any assumptions, because that one small assumption you thought was fine will bite you in the butt later.
It sounds like you went through that at least once.
Giacomo, what's your point of view?
Yeah, I mean, testing beforehand, of course, planning ahead and finding the right architecture. I mean, M2A has already done a very good job on that. If someone else had to do that, I guess they would have to see it beforehand and find the right architecture to get the right scalability, the right resilience. You always want to be in a situation when you don't want to have a disaster. You want to plan around disasters because you know that they're going to happen at some point, either on your CDN or either on your load balancer or in your origins. Something is going to happen. So you have to plan ahead that and make sure that you have a system that is resilient to those kind of failures, because they're going to be there. For example, one of the things that you want to handle is, of course, having always redundant path in your contribution and your encoding. So one of the things that, for example, we always advise our customers to implement in these scenarios when reliability is key is use a redundant encoder and packager setup. That's what we call REAP, right? So it's basically a way where encoders and packagers work together so that streams are always aligned with respect to a time anchor. And even when you have multiple encoders, all the segments are aligned in terms of duration and start time. And this gives you maximum resilience to event like, for example, an encoder going down for a little while and missing a few segments, or a network path between an encoder or packager going down for some reason and being late for some reason. If you have such a setup and you have it and working with the origin that supports REAP, you basically have a system where you can substitute a segment from the one coming from another packager or from the one coming from the other encoder. So it gives you maximum flexibility and gives you maximum resilience to those kind of events. So it's something probably to keep in mind from the beginning, because it involves the configuration of your encoder, it involves the configuration of your packager. So once you get that right, you're building on more solid basis.
We had our prep call with you guys, and I really like the point that sports event is something where something definitely goes wrong, and your job is to prepare for this wrong and to just to admit that it will happen and to be ready for this. So I think, that's the main point.
It's part of testing. There are actually chaos monkeys. It's very, very famous tools where you basically have a random component in your system crash or be offline at a specific random point in time. Everything needs to keep working. So very nice and interesting and chilling way of testing.
Thank you. So, the major streaming is not just about the major audience. It's also about being ready for this audience and just admitting that you need to do a lot of stuff beforehand. And I think that's most of the stuff that we wanted to share today. We have 2 QR codes on the screen. You can read more about our shared story of FIFA Club World Cup 25. And also we are sharing the article with some main points how to prepare for streaming sports. And I think we're ready to move to Q&A session. And we already have questions. Feel free to ask your questions as well. So the question is, supporting different devices for sports streaming is still an issue?
100%. Yes, 100%. For a global audience, you're going to get, potentially tens of thousands of different device configurations you've got to be able to support. And that's a difficult thing to do. Thankfully, it's something that M2A only have to deal with a small amount of it, and that's just essentially the ADR stream compliance and making sure that works across all those multitude of different devices. We deliver out using HLS, Dash, and smooth streaming. Yes, smooth streaming is still a massive thing. Project Kill Smooth hasn't happened really, and there are still millions and millions and millions of devices out there in the field, particularly CE devices like set-top boxes and TVs, and you've got to cater for them. And it's not just from from the packaging, the general packaging perspective, but from the encoding perspective, dealing with those legacy devices, where you have to deliver from everything that is a very low power mobile device all the way up to an 8K TV that's running HDR with Dolby Vision and Dolby Atmos. You've got to be able to deliver to all of those, all devices in that breadth. And if you're going to try and reach a true global audience, you've got to support as many devices as possible.
Another question: is there anything you would recommend to not do if an event needs to scale out massively?
Oh, that's an interesting one. Thanks, Ronald. Anything I would not do. I mean, anything you can really do is try and mitigate the thundering herds. If you've got a big free-to-air event where potentially you don't need to use quite as robust content protection, then you might choose to do that. It's very few and far between where you have those kind of events where they're massive events and they're all free-to-air. These days, a lot of the events are classed as premium, and they're delivered by the premium sports providers. So, that's not often something you can choose to do. Is kind of reduce the complexity of your content protection systems. But where possible, reduce complexity everywhere you can. Try and use caching everywhere you can. Try and use similar streams to deliver out to the different audiences. One of the use cases I suggested where you have multiple channels coming in with a different channel for each territory, one for Spain, one for Italy, one for Germany, one for Greece, one for whoever. And rather than go do that, actually think about deliver one picture but with personalized graphics, and use a graphics overlay service to be able to have your one source of video, but actually you use personalized graphics. Or use the per territory graphics, and then do late binding of audio, so make sure you've got your different audio commentaries and different audio captions available. That reduces the complexity from an encoding point of view, and then potentially deliver that as part of the end user experience, where you then package it up to the end user specifically in the territory that they are. That would be a big game changer for folks, and there are certainly some industry moves to move to do that exact thing, where possible. Again, if you need to go and do regional ops, try and do that using an insertion service. Don't always have a separate channel that's there specific for your spun up channel that's specific just for that territory broadcast. Use regional ops and use SSAIs or something like that to actually do that insertion of that regional specific program material.
So the next question: during a major live event, how do you manage accountability across the ecosystem and avoid losing time when suppliers start pointing to each other's systems?
A significant amount of instrumentation. I guess one of the key adage is instrument absolutely everything you can. Use CMCD, etc. Make sure that every client you're analyzing, using any of the widely deployed industry tools to, analyzing their sessions, making sure that, if a user is experiencing a buffering problem from one CDN and you rotate them to a different CDN, that you have that telemetry available and you're able to then action that and alarm on that. If we're seeing a one particular CDN in a territory, being degraded either through traffic or through an incident, then being able to understand that and to highlight that to your operators who are managing the service as quickly as possible is absolutely key. Without the telemetry, you're going to fail quickly. So having telemetry everywhere you can is absolutely vital. And obviously having the teams available to interpret that telemetry and to be able to go and view dashboards and escalate when issues occur. Issues occur all the time. You can't get away from dealing with exceptions. Unfortunately, it doesn't always work 100%. So having those teams in place to be able to mitigate that as quickly as possible is really, really critical.
And I think here we're circling back to the point that you need to test things ahead and to make sure that all the partners work together and everything's smooth.
Yep. Any provider such as DAZN, or if you look at someone like a Formula One, or you look at any of those big providers, big sports owners, they can't deliver these things on their own. You have to have a network of trusted partners to be successful delivering live broadcast video out. I think we've been very, very lucky, over the last few years to work with some of the best in the industry, and making sure that you're working with your partners diligently to take software updates, look at potential pinch points within infrastructure, actually work with them to plan out large tentpole events, so that you're not going to have all the knowledge yourselves in your own teams. Working with those partners to sketch out what you think might be problematic, it is absolutely critical for being successful. And that goes across, whether it be DRM, watermarking, packaging vendors, encoders, the multitude of CDNs. For Club World Cup, I think we worked with 22 different CDNs. And I see that increasing every other month, with more CDNs coming online that are territory specific, and having to work, you've got to work with them really closely to ensure you're successful. And DAZN's teams did that very effectively.
All right. Next question: where's the bottleneck for latency?
Absolutely everywhere. So I mean, obviously you've got latency from your optics going into the camera. There's latency from camera into the back of your OB eventually, and then latency going into your MCR, transiting that potentially across oceans, or going over via satellite. There's latency everywhere in the chain. Maintaining a really good user experience it's great to get latency down, so that the user gets to experience things as close to real time as possible. So optimizing what you do from an encoding perspective, keeping group of pictures down, making sure that your buffers for your contribution ingest into your encoders is as minimal as possible, but as safe as possible, because outages happen. Network latency is a problem, and issues do occur if you have things set too aggressively. All the way out through your packaging, making sure that your fragment sizes are optimized where you can, and where you have the capability in field. You choose a delivery protocol that is going to be as low latency as possible. Obviously, with the low latency protocols that we have in industry now, for low latency HLS and Dash in particular, for delivering out mass scale, you can get really fine grained latency down to a few seconds. But obviously that comes at a cost for requests, and comes at a cost for a cost for CDN complexity as well. Because you've still got to deliver your standard HLS and Dash streams as well, which don't have low latency, because you've got to reach as many devices as possible. So yeah, it's a constant fight to try and pull latency out of the systems. Media over Quick, one of the kind of more recent kind of emerging standards, is, I think it's going to be transformative to the industry. And obviously we're working diligently to make sure we can have media over Quick support with all of our egress services, and obviously working with one of the folks at Unified on that as well, to make sure from a packaging perspective we can deliver over MOC. But yeah, latency occurs everywhere in the chain. Optimize absolutely everything you can. Optimize playback buffers actually at the end user device as well. But the critical thing is maintaining a consistent and reliable user experience. And to do that, you're always going to introduce some latency.
I think that ties back with the previous question, what not to do. Do not start with latency as a goal. because,
yes.
Because the first thing should really be the reliability and being able to serve all viewers with a good user experience. That's latency, that's always a compromise. You reduce latency, and you reduce also the reliability of your stream. So you have to find a good spot. So yeah, do not start with latency one.
Yeah, sport fans are very demanding. They can live with latency, but if something breaks,
exactly.
If things break, they're very, very quick to let you know. The storms you get on social media when something goes wrong are quite mind-boggling, and things get escalated very quickly. So yeah, consistent, reliable user experience is way more critical than getting your frames to the viewer in under a couple of seconds. Yeah, it trumps everything.
So we almost run out of time, and I have the last question. What should be owned by the platform? What should be owned by vendors? And what should be aligned between everyone?
So that's an interesting and complex question. Thanks for that. So, I mean, obviously, I think full end user experience has to be owned by the platform. You have to own the actual delivery of that end user experience, making it personalized to your brand and your brand values. I think for everything else in the chain, where I wouldn't say that every item is completely commoditized, but where you have a multitude of potential vendors and partners out there to be really successful, I don't think there's actually a need, unless you're talking of someone who is Netflix kind of scale where they want to be vertically integrated. I think, any other real platform that's not operating at quite that scale, go and talk to vendors and partners. Go and find best of breed partners to deliver things. You don't want to get into the minutiae of having to deploy your DRM licensing systems at massive scale. Yes, you might need to deploy proxies for doing authentication and doing validation of sessions, but you don't want to get into the headache of having to manage the full DRM licensing and entitlement and device management and all of those wonderful things. Go and get a partner, like an Adetto or Vermatrix or whoever, to go and Cast Labs, etc. Go and get those partners in place to help you deliver those critical services. They're best of breed partners. They've got the experience and the knowledge, and you go and use them. And similar for packaging vendors. You go and talk to Unified about how to build a packager. Don't build it yourself. It's a crazy idea to go and try and get the kind of reach that you need and deal with the complexity of HLS Dash and Smooth, never mind the other emerging standards. It's a highly complex topic, and they've got experts there who really know what they're doing, and you don't want to go and reinvent the wheel when you can go and buy a very, very shiny wheel that works perfectly.
Yeah, from our point of view, it's critical that our responsibility is to always make sure that we are on top of the standards. I mean, we really believe in standards as a way to support all our customers across the world, to create solutions that are interoperable with all the different complex parts that are constitute an end-to-end media workflows. At the same time, I think it's important also that the vendor is there to support the customers in the onboarding part. So when you're building a solution, because of course standards are the solid foundation of a reliable solution, but then there's always something that you have to tweak and customize, and it's important that the vendor is there to listen and consider and fixes or feature requests or adaptations that are important for customers to implement their solution successfully.
Cool, thank you. That was our last question. And for the audience, feel free to reach out to our amazing speakers. You see emails on the screen. You can also find us everywhere on LinkedIn and Slack dev community. Just feel free to ask any of your questions. And thank you all for joining. It was a very interesting conversation. Thank you, guys.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you all for attending.
Thanks for joining us.
It's a pleasure.